We'd like to thank you for joining us for another episode of Looking to Jesus. My name is John Hines. I am the preacher for the Church of Christ in North Ridgeville, Ohio. I'm joined by my co-host, Daniel Sanders. Good morning, Daniel.
Good morning, John.
How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you today?
I'm doing all right. So, what are we going to be talking about today?
The Bible.
Well, that's very helpful.
You're welcome.
Well, we're getting,
Sermon on the Mount.
We're getting started off on the right foot.
Yes,
that's
we're going to start
excellent.
things off on the right foot. We're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, and we have been, what we label as a Sermon on the Mount, and we are looking at some of the different things of you have heard that it was said, and this is what I say to you, kind of statements that Jesus makes here in Matthew chapter 5. And so today's is looking at lust, marriage, divorce, kind of all in the gist of everything.
Yeah. So we're about halfway through Matthew chapter 5. And let's just read a little bit. This is Matthew 5, verse 27. You have heard that it was said to those of old. So there's the idea you just mentioned. You shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife, for any reason except sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. Now, we will say in the fine print, for today's episode, Brother Sanders here thought we should stop there and pick up there next week, but we're going to include the following passage this week. That's right, Daniel. I'm starting off by confessing your sins. You're welcome. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes, and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one. All right. So to look at the passage, and I thought we might just start with how big of an issue is divorce. That's what everybody always wants to talk about. And it is an issue. It has always been an issue. And you can tell in the Old Testament, it was a big issue.
Yes.
And the commentators that talk about that, and you can tell from Scripture, when they come, is it Matthew 19 where Jesus mentions because of the hardness of your heart?
Yes.
And that it was allowed, he says, what is it, Matthew 19?
1 through 12.
Yeah, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And then he basically repeats in Matthew 19 what he says in the Sermon on the Mount.
I will say there is a little bit more there in the Matthew 19 passage in here, because you get some conclusions that people look at, especially, I'm jumping a little bit ahead of everything, but looking at verse 32 of Matthew 5, where right there the end statement, whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. Yeah. And just kind of saying you can't marry, making the conclusion you can't marry anyone who's divorced. And then kind of jumping that, but Jesus kind of offers a little bit of, not saying he's contradicting himself, but he goes into further detail there in the Matthew 19 passage to explain a little bit more. Because I don't know if you've dealt with it much, but I've had it been told to me before, jumping to that conclusion that Jesus was making a contradiction of himself, which he wasn't. But he was, it says here, if you marry someone who's divorced, you commit adultery. That's it. Well, he explains further.
Yeah.
These things in a different setting of everything too.
Yeah. And certainly divorce is a huge problem.
It is.
And it's, the Lord takes it back to the garden. And he's like, Moses permitted this because, frankly, you guys were hard-hearted. But from the beginning, it was not so. And that this is how, and I think it's interesting. I want to make a point about the Matthew 19 passage.
Yeah.
Because in Matthew 19, it says, the Pharisees, verse 3, they come to him and they say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? So they come and they want to talk about divorce.
Yeah.
This is the Lord's answer. Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. They said to him, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce to put her away? And then you have the clarification. But I think it's interesting that initially they want to talk about divorce, and Jesus' answer is to talk about marriage.
Yeah. And here, and then kind of, I don't know if this is where you're looking at it, then it says, not talking about divorce, let's talk about lust. Let's talk about the root cause of everything. Let's talk about marriage. Let's talk about what marriage is supposed to be like here in Matthew 19. And then he says, let's get to where the issue arises, or where the problem arises.
And it's like, rather than try to, it's like, let's do a little preventative maintenance.
Yes.
Don't wait for things to break.
Yeah.
Before, I guess I actually ought to do something. It's like, why don't you try doing something before that, so we don't have to talk about divorce.
Right.
And so I just think it's interesting. They want to talk about divorce, like everybody wants to talk about divorce. And Jesus is like, why don't you talk about marriage? It's like, why don't you try loving your wife?
Yeah.
And so anyway, back to Matthew 5. And actually, before we do go back, Malachi says God hates divorce. It covers one with bloodshed. That's one of the passages. And it is horrible. It is horrible. And we need to recognize how horrible it is. And there are, people in your life who've been divorced. I know people in my life who've been divorced. And we can talk, and even here in Matthew 5 and Matthew 19, there's only one scriptural reason for divorce.
Yeah.
And that's fornication. If someone fools around on the other one. Does that mean, and that's the only reason, so I have to be careful how I say this. My point is the passage in Malachi says it covers one's garment with violence. And there's a lot of finger pointing that happens in a divorce. And there may be one party who is guilty of adultery. But sometimes there's a lot of other sins involved. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The buildup of everything of, why someone may have committed adultery or fornicated with someone because of other reasons or other sins that have, encouraged it or provoked it to that situation.
And so I that Malachi passage, God hates it. It covers one with violence. And it's not good. And the Lord is not saying, because someone commits adultery, thou shalt go to divorce. It's like, it can be worked through. It can happen, and people can reconcile, and that's extremely difficult. But the Lord recognizes how difficult that is, so He gives this reason for. This is the only scriptural reason for divorce: adultery. Oh, we could go down that rabbit hole further, but I don't know. Do you really? Because people try to play around with it.
Yeah, Whether it's the verbiage. I mean, I've known individuals who have tried to say, "Well, we didn't get divorced. We had a dissolution." We start trying to use different words. And I'm like, it's the same thing. Yeah, it's the same meaning. Right. When you take, when you say, for instance, you try to change the word. Well, we didn't get divorced. The marriage got dissolved or dissolution or whatever word you want to use. It's a separation. It's still all the same. That doesn't, just because you use a different word doesn't mean that it's justified in any type of way. When you break away from your marriage,
call it a rose by any other name is still a rose, and divorce by any other name is still a rose.
Exactly.
Call it a dissolution, call it an annulment, whatever. Yeah. It's like, no, you were married, and now you're not married. Another way that I've heard people play around with this whole issue is, and let me throw a scenario out at you. And like I said, it's like you can get into the weeds real quickly.
Oh, yeah.
You have someone commits adultery. The spouse takes them back. Okay? Takes them back.
Yeah.
With conditions. Okay? And whatever those conditions may be. And lo and behold, the person who comes back, they don't meet all of those conditions. So they've been taken back, but they do not do what their spouse wants them to do. Not cheating on them, right? But there's some other condition. And because that condition was not met, okay, well, now I'm putting you away for adultery. Hold on a second.
We start going down sticky situation with all that stuff, and
like I said, you get into the weeds real quickly.
Yeah. You know, the whole idea of the race to the courthouse, whoever gets to the courthouse first, sort of thing. We can be able to, try to say that that's the winner of everything, even though that's really not the way to look at it. But that's how some people would take it. You start looking at you could throw in any type of different scenario to be able to discuss as to reasons why, and people have tried to stretch the imagination as far as they can, when in reality it's been given by Jesus how one can get divorced, what reason one can get divorced. And as we look at that, you look at the Matthew 19, but kind of looking at the process of relationships, if they're allowed to get divorced by this, and they're allowed to be married to someone else.
Right.
Other than that, it's adultery.
Yep. Okay, so now let's talk about marriage. And let's talk about, because I think that's the ultimate answer to the issue. It's, okay, let's talk about marriage. And so to look at the passage that we read back in Matthew chapter 5, and I thought we might start with commitment.
Yeah.
And that's one reason I did want to include the passage about oaths, let your yes be yes and your no be no. I think that's more general, but to just see how it applies to this situation. You look like you want to say something.
You're just rubbing it in my face that I was not prepared to do that.
I would never do that. I would never do that. But to just see how it applies, and it's like, you made a vow.
Yeah.
You made a promise. And according to the Matthew 19 passage, by the way, it's what God has joined together. It's like you made a promise before God.
Yeah.
And in those vows, and again, I understand different cultures have different marriage ceremonies, things like that. There's always been some sort of something, though, some sort of.
There's been witnesses.
There's been
at least
weddings.
One witness to be able to see everything, whether it's the person performing the ceremony or someone that's just there in the audience and they're sitting there exchanging of different things. But more importantly, like you just said there, you're making it. Not only is it maybe a physical person we can see with our own eyes, but God, who we cannot see, is a witness of this, and you have done this before God,
right?
And when I think about the oath passage, I'm also thinking about Ecclesiastes 7. When you make a vow, you pay it back.
Yeah,
and I know it talks there, especially when you make a vow to God, you pay it back.
Yeah,
when you make a vow. Any type of vow, and we could look Old and New Testament, when there was a vow made and God was a witness of it, it was supposed to be honored. You look at Hannah, for instance.
Right.
She made a vow to be able to have the male child, had Samuel, and then, okay, I'm going to give the child back to the Lord to be able to work in the temple until the child is weaned and everything. You have Samson, who he was supposed to have no razor come to his head. He made a vow being a Nazirite.
Right.
What happens when he breaks that vow? We see there was consequences for such actions. You could look, I'm just using just a couple of those real quick that come to mind, but then also the marriage of everything. God is joined together. We're not to separate. We are making a commitment, as you're talking about, to one another to be able to be joined together, to be able to be there for one another in all sorts of different circumstances of everything, through thick and thin. If there is a reason why we have to break that commitment, again, I go back to what Jesus said. There's one reason.
Yeah.
But we have to work on commitment.
And that's the reason, is it Hebrews, where it talks about the marriage bed undefiled?
Yes.
Marriage is honorable amongst all, and the bed undefiled. If the bed's defiled, that's, the Lord understands that when that happens. But when we talk about commitment, and I've been married, oh no, I'm putting myself on the spot, 20 years. How long have you been married, Daniel?
18 and a half.
18 and a half. So, I mean, when we made those vows, and I don't know what your vows were like I said, different cultures may have different vows, but I think the overall idea, if divorce if sexual immorality is the only reason for divorce, then that means, well, what is not a viable reason for divorce? And so you get into the vows, and it's through good times and bad. Bad times are not a reason for divorce. And you start going to this commitment issue that we are committed through good times and bad. We are committed through health and sickness. We're committed through for richer or for poorer. We are committed.
Yeah.
Like there is no plan B. This is commitment. And that commitment better be based on more than outward beauty. Because we know what Proverbs 31 says, beauty's fading.
Yeah.
And so if a person is just basing things on what the other person looks like, it's like, I don't know about you, but I don't look the same way I looked 20 years ago.
No.
And I'm not going to, in 20 years, if Kentucky Fried Chicken hadn't taken me out of this world, I'm not going to look like what I look like now.
Yeah.
And that, yeah, you have to look beyond. It's like you need to learn to see things how God sees things. And that beauty is fading, but that inner beauty is what should be appreciated. And you're committed, man. And it's like you made this promise.
Yeah.
And you better keep that promise.
Right.
And not just be there. There are fair weather Christians and there are fair weather spouses. And it's like, oh, when things are good, oh, okay, But it's like, what when things are bad?
Yeah.
And so then you start thinking about, all the stuff that has to go into that marriage if you're going to be committed. And you're going to be one flesh, by the way. And I didn't know if I wanted to talk about this with this point or our next point. We're going to talk about love. But I've known people who saw divorce as shameful, and it is shameful.
Yeah.
And it's like they lived in opposite ends of the house. And they didn't love each other. We're still married though. And it's like, yeah, you're married, but your marriage is dysfunctional. You're not one flesh.
Yeah.
You're not, when scripture talks about husbands, dwell with them with understanding. Do not be bitter towards them. And so it's commitment, but it's not just commitment. It's like, we're, stuck together. It's like the ball and chain.
Yeah.
It's like, man, that ain't good.
Right. Right.
And so I'm glad you're not divorced, but you sure don't have a godly marriage when things like that are happening.
Yeah.
But it's like you made a promise and you keep your vows. Yeah, like I said, God's joined what God has joined together. And there better be some respect for that.
Yeah, there should be. Again, God has blessed everything with us and has provided, us with our spouses as well. And
he who finds a wife finds a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
we find the, and that's where, let me retract back a little bit. That's where,
no retractions.
We don't jump the gun when it comes to this. When you talk about commitment, we don't just jump the gun and just find the first person.
Right. You don't take it lightly. And, I've mentioned before with congregation, Justine and I, we met at Home Depot and, it was a few months. What aisle? Plumbing aisle?
It was the plumbing aisle. I was working in the plumbing aisle. She was working in special services.
I didn't realize Home Depot was so romantic.
I know it. We had our whole wedding planned out of where we were going to get married at and everything in the store and everything. And anyway, but I had one person, we were married. We were together for a couple months, and then, we were committed in trying to serve God together and everything. And then, I think it was about 3 or 4 months after we were together. I say don't jump the gun, but then also sometimes with things from time to time, and we got engaged, and it wasn't a matter of just trying to jump the gun to get married that next day. We took time to be able to plan everything out, and I had one girl. She was 2 years older. I was 21 at the time, or getting ready to turn 21, and the comment to me was, well, if it doesn't work out, you can just get a divorce. And she was getting ready to get married for the third time, and she was 2 years older than me.
Yeah.
I was just kind of.
Yeah, that's how the world looks at
That's
it.
how there's no commitment. It's not taken seriously.
Do you think that issue? I didn't realize we were going to go down this this lane. That issue of loyalty. That's a big issue, and within our society. And I'm just thinking of how it used to be that people were loyal. And like I said, I understand divorce has always been an issue. I think it's worse now than just say 75 years ago or 100 years ago. But loyalty in general, that people have trouble with loyalty in marriage. People have trouble with loyalty in employment. People have trouble with loyalty with, there may be other scenarios in life where it's just this idea of let your yes be yes and your no be no.
Mm-hmm.
Now, something may happen where you have to, deal with consequences. It's like, man, have some loyalty. And like I said, the person who's already been divorced 2 times, and it's like, wow, you don't have much loyalty.
Yeah.
And if you don't have loyalty over this, will you have loyalty with other things?
Yeah.
If you don't keep your vows with this, what about other vows that you make? We'll come back to that towards the end. Okay, so commitment, but commitment without love is just hollow. So let's talk about love. And I was thinking about the passage concerning adultery when it talks about lusts. He says, "You've heard it said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Like we said last week, the Lord's trying to get them to think about things inwardly.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, adultery is bad. Lust is bad. And think about where adultery starts. What's the root of adultery? Because it rarely starts in the bedroom.
Yeah.
It starts with lust. It may start with other things, as well, just thinking about flirtations and things like that. But in thinking about love, it's like, be content with your wife. Love your wife. Is it 1 Corinthians, where does it talk about render the affection that is due her?
I believe it's 1 Corinthians 7.
1 Corinthians 7 and that idea. And it's like, love your wife. And we're talking about more than just the marriage bed. And it's be affectionate.
Yeah.
Praise her. Proverbs 31. Her husband and her children praise her. And so when it comes to marriage, it's love your wife. Again, people want to talk about divorce. It's like, man, love your wife.
Yeah, get down to the root of everything. You show that love for your wife. You show that you're building that relationship. Things get bad. What do? You fix it. You try to fix it with everything that you do, and that comes through love. Right. Love covers them. Covers a whole multitude of different things. We read, love covers a multitude of sins, but love helps build the relationship. 1 Corinthians 13 talks about all the different things. The greatest of all things is what?
Right.
Is love.
In that passage, while in the context of 1 Corinthians 13, it's how the brethren are treating one another.
Yeah.
But generally, you can make the applications like, this is what love does. Love does not behave rudely. Love doesn't parade itself. Love does not think upon evil. It doesn't, it's like, no, that's not what love does.
Yeah.
And that, then you take the positive, and let me turn over there. What are the positives from that passage? Good grief.
Hebrews 13:4, love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Yeah. Love does not praise itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails.
Yeah. And you love them. And it's, you love.
You can be disappointed with things and be upset about different things, but there's still that love that we should be having towards one another. towards our spouses, where we're to continue to build each other up, continue to not allow, we still love them, we still care for them, we should have that love for them, that affection, as you're reading 1 Corinthians 7:3 earlier. We're to be able to have and express all of these different things, and how it continues to build, continues to develop, continues to show all these different attributes, continues to endure, has that patience and confidence and that endurance of everything. There are so many different things about love that we are to have, and that's just thrown out the door. It just is not the same as what it's supposed to be today, where we see love is just not there. It's not expressed. It's like sometimes, some people are so stoned up that they can't express any type of love. Could it be from other situations? Yes, but if you're going to have a spouse, you got to be able to love them. You got to be able to treat them and take care of them and nourish them. We look at the relationship of how it's supposed to be between husbands and wife in Ephesians 5 about Christ and the church. We're to be able to love one another, we're to cherish one another, we're to nourish each other, take care of each other, purify one another, be able to do whatever we can to help one another as Christ does for the church.
And in that idea, when Job spoke to his wife and he said, you sound like one of the townswomen, and should we accept good and not this from the Lord? And that he rebuked her. And it says, and he did not sin with his lips. Like, that's also what love does. And so we help one another. And it's like, we are one flesh. We are one body. We communicate. We dwell with them and we work together from the very beginning. It's like, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helpmeet comparable to him. And it's like, there's work to do. I always like that passage, I like to make the point, just because I think it's a good point, that all things were good. God made everything and it was good. And I asked the question one time in Bible class, well, what about, because everything was good before, and I asked, before sin entered the world, was everything good? And of course, knee-jerk reaction is, well, yeah, everything was good. He created everything good. And yet God said, it is not good that man be alone. I'll make him a helper. And that's before sin entered the world. And like I said, he who finds a wife finds a good thing. And Adam had Eve, a helpmeet made for him. And it's like, love your wives. Love your spouse, love your husband. And to mix that in with commitment. And all you have to do is just think about how the Lord loves us. Like you said, Ephesians 5. Can we sometimes be unlovable? Yes. I'm looking for an amen, Daniel.
Yes. No, we're always lovable.
Sometimes we can be unlovable. And we can be, to speak sings how we're two husbands. We can... It's like sometimes we can be dunderheads, sometimes we can be brutish, sometimes we can be jerks, sometimes we can do all those things. And we're thankful our wives still love us, and we love our wives, and we work together, and we're growing together. And commitment better be a part of that, because the whole, we fell out of love. Well, then you got a problem with commitment.
Yeah.
You're not keeping your vows. But we need to love, absolutely. But also the Matthew 5 passage, the business about if your hand offends you, if your eye offends you. And we'll also say concerning lust. And let's make this point. A lot of people, they want to talk about pornography in this day and age as though pornography is anything new. Pornography is nothing new. It's always been around. Good grief. Read a little bit about Corinth, the city in Corinth, with the temple to Aphrodite and the 1,000 temple prostitutes, and tell us how porn is a new thing. Lust has always been around. It has always been around. And the problem is not, and people are going to be, I can't believe he just said that. Porn's not the problem. It's not the problem. The problem is a lack of discipline. And that if your hand offends, what is he talking about when he says, if your eye offends you, what do? You cut it out. And it's like, he's talking about self-discipline. He's talking about the same thing that Job talked about a long time before this. One of the quotes from Job, I have made a covenant with my eyes to not look on a young woman. I mean, isn't he talking about self-discipline?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what he's talking about. You're always going to see stuff. There will be opportunities. David's up walking on the roof of his house, and all of a sudden he looks down, and what does he see?
He sees Bathsheba out there bathing.
And was it wrong to see her? It's like, he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And whole nother lesson about that. But then he kept looking.
He kept looking, and then he inquired.
Yeah.
And, who is this? And he was, she's very beautiful. Okay, well, now we're starting to get into we've crossed the line.
Right.
With everything. Right. I mean,
we violated self-discipline.
Yeah. I'm not trying to sit there and say, look for, not trying to, no pun intended, but, you're not trying to look for an opportunity.
Right.
Your son's where it's just right there. And it's like,
right.
Turn away from it. Right. We could talk about Joseph and what happened with him, and how the woman, Potiphar's wife was trying to present herself to him,
right.
and try to get him to commit sin, and he would not. And what did he do? He ended up running out,
right,
away from her while she had hold of his garment, trying to bring him in. And
he said, "I cannot do this to the Lord. I cannot do it to my master. I can't do it to you. I can't do it for me." It's like, that sounds like he had commitment figured out.
Yeah. He had some sort of commitment. He understood that she was to be committed to her husband with this,
right.
While, I don't think it says that he was married at the time.
Joseph? No.
Yeah. But he understood the commitment, and understood the commitment to God,
right,
as well. It wasn't just a matter of just, not just one way. He explained everything as to why he couldn't engage himself with it. There was multiple ways of being able to practice and have that control over himself.
Yeah,
on the matter.
To look through the Sermon on the Mount and to think about how Jesus was dealing with the Jews and what the Jews' religion had turned into, and somewhat just the nature of the old law, where you have, just for example, the dietary laws.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, and no, this is not a tangent. I'm going to make an application. But it's like, okay, you have the dietary laws. You cannot eat certain animals. And then Jesus comes on the scene, and what does he say about what defiles a man? And he says, it's not what goes into a man that defiles him. It's what comes out. And that is such a mind-blowing thing, and it's just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
It was very mind-blowing for the Jews. They're like, whoa, what are you talking about? Bacon is sinful. Don't you know bacon is sinful? And the Lord's like, no. The problem's not the bacon. The problem is what comes out of your heart. The problem is not, and to make that application, it's like if you heard a curse word, that you're going to hear stuff like that.
Yeah.
My kids have entered the workforce. They hear stuff like that. That's not the issue. Hearing it's not the issue.
Right.
It's what comes out of you. Seeing nakedness. You're going to see nakedness. That's not the issue. It's going to be there. There's times where you're going to see it. That's not the issue. It's not what goes into you. It's what comes out of you. And that's the lust.
Yeah.
And that's where, okay, you have to have self-discipline. You have to have self-denial. And one of the ways to deal with that, and I think, okay, let's go over to 1 Corinthians, Daniel.
Okay.
What is it, 1 Corinthians 7?
Which one? Yeah, that's the one over there. And talking about the relationship of husband and wife. And everything.
Yeah, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And let's, I just realized we needed to make another point, because we're going to look at the tail end of 1 Corinthians 6, because one of the questions is, well, if whoever lusts for a woman has already committed adultery in his heart, so does that mean that lust is grounds for divorce? That's one of the questions sometimes people ask.
That's one of the questions that people want to ask and try to...
And I personally go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6 as a simple way to answer that question that says, flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. There are different kinds of sin, and this is one of those places where you can show that every other kind of sin is one, but sexual immorality is different. Namely, and I think the Lord, to that point of what does the Lord recognize as grounds for divorce? And it's sexual immorality specifically. It's defiling, that passage, it is defiling one's own body. So, I don't know. You got any hot takes on that before I move on? Because the question is, concerning porn, is porn grounds for divorce? That's the question that a lot of people get, and I understand as well. Pornography is changing. Namely, it's becoming more interactive.
Yeah.
Not to be too indiscreet, but it is becoming more interactive on, stuff like that. So it may get to that point. And none of that changes anything that we've said, namely, love your wife.
Yeah.
Be committed to your wife. Be committed to your spouse. And I keep saying wife just because I'm a guy. And I'm not trying to be chauvinistic. It's like, be committed to your spouse.
Yeah.
Whatever the case may be. Chapter 7, to think about, verse 9, if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. My point is, you have a young person. Not everybody can be a eunuch for the kingdom's sake.
Yeah.
Not everybody can be celibate.
Right.
Not everybody should be celibate. Paul could be. Paul was a eunuch for the kingdom's sake. That was a liberty that he exercised.
Peter was married.
Yeah,
talk about different
married.
apostles that we can be able to make some points about.
Right. And my point is, I don't like it when we're talking about discipline, right? Within this point, we need to have discipline.
Yes.
There's a reason that in certain religions that the priesthood, the priests have had trouble with child molestation and things like that. It's like they are trying to force celibacy on a group of people that the Lord never did.
Yeah.
That the Lord never did. And so those individuals have a lot of trouble, obviously, denying themselves.
Yeah.
And the Lord, understanding that not everybody can be a eunuch for the kingdom's sake, expressed, says, if they can't exercise self-control, let them marry. It is he who finds a wife finds a good thing. And so the answer for younger people, I don't go in for long engagements. Let me put it like that. That's real simple. I don't like it when people are like, oh, well, we were engaged for 18 years. What? I know, I'm exaggerating for emphasis sake.
Yeah.
But it's like, okay, I understand there's a time, there's an engagement time. There's a betrothal time, that idea. At some point, get married and get married. If you know it's the person, get married.
Right.
And then enjoy marriage and be content with your spouse and love them and keep your vows and have that discipline. For those who are single, you got to be disciplined and learn how to possess your own soul in sanctification, right? You got to deny yourself. And then it gets to the point where it's like, okay, you need to get married.
Yeah.
Find a spouse. You can't, you're probably not going to be like Paul and be celibate your whole life. Not many people can do that. I couldn't do that. Could you do that?
No.
No. Paul could do that. Barnabas could do that. Peter, he was married. Good for him. Paul was not. Okay. It's not for everyone. Anyway, discipline. All that's to say this. Our 3 main points, and yes, Johnny 3 points strikes again. Our 3 points are commitment, love, and discipline. And I want to tie it back in and you jumped the gun because I didn't warn you about this, because you went to the Ephesians 5 passage. And yes, and you're like, yeah, I know. This is how we think about Jesus. This is how we think about the church.
Right.
Commitment. And it's like, there is no plan B. It's like, no, we are committed and we keep our vows.
Yeah.
We hold fast the confession, and we do it in love because we love the Lord and we love our brethren, and sometimes our brethren are unlovable or that we have trouble loving them. We love. We're committed, and we practice discipline. We discipline ourselves. That's what we have to do. So whether we're talking about marriage, spouses, or whether we're talking about we're the bride of Christ, and it's like it's the same points. Same points. That's all I got, Daniel. What else you got?
Well, I want to just think about, we were talking about the whole idea of lust and everything, and just looking at everything of how we're to have a relationship. Lust is not of God. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, the pride of life. It's not of God, and it's of the world. 1 John 2:15 and 17. The world's passing away in the lust of it, but he who does the will of God. God has given us his word and his will on how we're to conduct ourselves as spouses, as that love for one another, as that commitment for one another. Again, as you were pointing out earlier, it's we're going to face these temptations. They're going to come our way. It's the matter of self-control, disciplining ourselves, bring our body into subjection, and being able to love our spouse and have that respect and honor for our spouse, for God, for our own body. I mean, there's a combination of everything that's needed to be able to continue to build each other up. I think about 2 Peter chapter 5, or 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 5 down to verse 11, about all the different things of building this bridge within ourselves, within our own spiritual household, our own spiritual bridge of everything. And self-control is right there in the midst of it all, being able to have that be one of those building blocks, being one of those joints to be able to complete ourselves and being able to have that hope and promise of eternal life. Self-control, discipline, it's all right there. Bringing our body into subjection in a proper way. Being able to love, being able to show that commitment, not looking at wanting to try to get out of things, but again, we're building a relationship. We're building a relationship with God as well, and it's an endurance. Just like our relationship with our spouse, it is an endurance. It is a lifelong commitment that we are to honor as long as we can, and as long as we're both living, unless we talk about what Jesus said was one reason only.
One thing you touched on it just barely when you were talking about you and your bride, and that this is one reason it's so important to marry a Christian.
Well,
and it's like, if they will be faithful to the Lord, guess what they won't do? They won't fool around on you. If they fool around on you, well, then they've sinned against God and sinned against you.
Well,
but anyway,
we see the successes are a higher chance of success.
Yeah. And my point is like, we're one flesh. We're working together, and if we're going two separate ways, that ain't good.
Right.
That's absolutely not good. Talking about lust is all about self. You know, it's like, what makes me happy?
Right.
Love is about making the other person happy. And lo and behold, it's more blessed to give than receive. And it's like this principle throughout Scripture that if we will love others, we will find ourselves loved. And that it will reciprocate.
Yeah.
As we sacrifice, and we'll find that they will reciprocate. And so that's the difference between lust and love. Lust, self. Love, others. What are you typing up? You're looking for something.
I'm just looking at something else, just thinking along these lines. It's okay. It's all right.
All right. Are you looking for a verse?
No.
Looking for a passage? So, I mean, it's always been an issue. Marital issues. And like I said, people want to talk about divorce all day long. And the Lord just says, let's talk about marriage. And let's talk about what makes a good and godly marriage. Because that is the bride.
Exactly. We should be looking at being able to build on the relationship, not try to get out of it. Trying to find some sort of loophole or whatever you may want to call it.
Yep, absolutely. So appreciate the study, Daniel.
Yes, appreciate everything as always.
Yep. Thank you very much for joining us for another episode. We hope you tune in next week. As we once again, we will still be in the Sermon on the Mount. Next week, I guess we're going to be talking about loving our enemies. So we hope you join us for that study as well. Thank you very much as we look unto Jesus as the author and finisher of the faith. Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you.